Hello everyone. Welcome back to the YouTube channel of stories about ghosts, Master Dewey. I hope everyone has a fascinating session listening to eerie stories. Before we start, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Now, let's move on to today's episode. Today, it won't be just scary ghost stories, but I will continue to tell you about the dark corners and the horror of sorcery. After listening to today's episode, please let me know if there is anything even scarier behind sorcery. The first story today is a true tale of the magic of tea drinkers from the region of Chaozhong. This story was sent by a female friend who mentioned that she has been hearing stories about sorcery all this time, and despite finding them interesting, she never thought that one day a relative in her family would get involved in sorcery. The person affected by this magical spell is her aunt, Aunt Tuesday. The issue is people don't understand why, for about 4 to 5 years now. Aunt Tu's family has always had conflicts and fights among themselves. Almost every day, there are disputes in the household. Not only are there internal family squabbles, but Aunt Tu's home is also constantly losing money. In general, whatever money they make seems to go out the door without being able to keep any. At the beginning, the family thought it was just normal quarrels, so they overlooked it. Additionally, everyone believed Aunt Tu's personality had changed since the day she underwent surgery for appendicitis, thinking that the blood transfusion had changed her character temporarily. However, the situation escalated when Aunt Tu's household had a quarrel with the neighbors over land disputes. They don't know exactly what happened on the day of that dispute, but both families started shouting at each other and have not spoken since. It was from that argument with the neighboring house that Aunt Tu began to suffer pain every night. The pain continuously occurred around midnight, at exactly 11 to 12 o'clock, making her belly twist with pain with no apparent cause. Can you imagine how unbearable it is to deal with constant stomach pain and diarrhea? It drove Aunt Tu to the doctor, but after examinations, there were no problems found in her digestive system, and each time she was just diagnosed with duodenitis. Aunt Tu's personality also changed. Previously, she was mild-mannered but now would explode at the slightest provocation, often admonishing her relatives for no reason, and could yell for hours without tiring or stopping. Because the family did not believe in superstitions, they didn't consult any practitioners or soothsayers. However, seeing the situation unfold, they reluctantly began to believe that their suffering had some strange cause. At this point, Aunt Tu's daughter had a boyfriend from Kodu in Kindo. He noticed Aunt Tu's condition and suggested taking her to see a sorcerer, even if they were originally skeptical. Reluctantly, Aunt Tu agreed to go to the practitioner. After a lot of convincing and pledging, she finally decided to visit the sorcerer with her daughter and her daughter's boyfriend. Upon arriving at the sorcerer's house, the sorcerer instructed the boyfriend to speak with Aunt Tu privately for a moment, before they proceeded to consult the sorcerer. There was a woman in the sorcerer's house who was conducting an exorcism. The sorcerer told everyone to sit and wait while he performed the ceremony for the woman. It was at that point that everyone observed the woman. The sorcerer instructed her to sit cross-legged at the foot of the bed, and next to her was a pot covered with a blanket, as if she were sick and was steaming. After a while of observation, everyone could hear eerie sounds coming from the woman while she was wrapped up in the blanket. Eventually, the sorcerer told them to return on the 18th of May, when he would be able to treat Aunt Tu's curse. The family went home, anxiously waiting for the date to come. They brought the sorcerer to their home, ready for his ceremony. On that day, the sorcerer wore black robes and stood before the ancestral altar, waiting for the sorcerer to indicate the accurate spot. After drilling for about 5 centimeters, he instructed them to stop and starting digging with their hands to uncover a burial site. The 2 children of Aunt Tu, a daughter born in the year of the ox and a son born in the year of the serpent, assisted in uncovering the dirt to see what lay beneath. As they continued digging, the sorcerer stood by, reciting mantras. Even without revealing anything yet, the sorcerer was sweating heavily, showing how serious this matter was. Then, they discovered a black plastic bag buried in the dirt. When they unwrapped it, they found it was tightly wrapped in a red cloth. Unraveling the red cloth, They found inscriptions that were not in Chinese characters, but in Vietnamese, clearly stating phrases like a family plagued by disease and madness, among others. In the center of the three phrases was a diagram resembling a hexagram, and the red cloth was wrapped around a doll's head, which was oddly deformed due to being tightly packed. When the sorcerer saw the charms, he firmly believed that these were made by a well-known practitioner from Chaozhong in Zhejiang. After recognizing it, he told the family to take this protective amulet and burn it in a place devoid of houses, with the sorcerer confirming he would conduct the cleansing ritual immediately. The family was taken aback because they had never believed in the supernatural. However, seeing the sorcerer's confidence, everyone was scared. The story continues, and it comes with surprises and additional mysteries regarding curses and sorcery among family, ultimately revealing the dark sides of human nature filled with jealousy and vindictiveness. As we conclude today's episode, please remember to like and subscribe to the YouTube channel to show your support. If you have thoughts on the story, leave your comments below for us to discuss further. And let's look forward to more gripping episodes ahead, especially for those who have just completed their military service, as well as for those who are currently serving in the Army. You must listen to this story. This story was sent by a guy from Thought Not, Kano. He said that he's been on military duty for 2 years, and after hearing Duwei tell stories today, he also wants to share his own experiences during those 2 years serving in Zhejiang. Since he was a child, he has encountered ghosts many times, so he is quite petrified until the year he enlisted in the military and was stationed in Zhejiang. Duwei will not mention the names of these camps, but after listening to this story, you can comment on what camp it is, okay? He said that when he just enlisted, he had trouble adjusting to the new way of living and being away from home, so he couldn't sleep well, constantly tossing and turning. At that time, he was assigned to sleep on the top bunk, and below him was another comrade. Since he couldn't sleep well, and his bed was right next to the door, it was often just slightly ajar. Generally, every night, he saw a shadow walking back and forth across the corridor, zigzagging as it moved. Because his bed was right next to the main door, which was not locked, just slightly opened. In short, every night he saw that shadow, but at that time he didn't think much about it. He just thought it was an officer on patrol, checking whether the soldiers in this room could sleep or not. He couldn't see their faces clearly because the lights inside were mostly turned off except for a dim light outside. Only when dawn arrived could he ask his squad leader, "Hey, these past few days, every night, you always pass by our room. Don't you have anything else to do?" At that point, the squad leader replied, "Oh my God, there's no one who has time to walk around." Later that night, the squad leader said he would check it out, so he pretended it was nothing. In short, during that time, he also followed the military routines. However, after tiring work, he could sleep very well. On days he studied less or didn't go for training, he couldn't sleep at all. Every night around 11 to 12 o'clock, he saw a shadow flitting back and forth in the corridor. A few times he even saw that shadow enter the room because the military always had wristwatches, so he was sure that shadow would appear right at 11 to 12 at night. He thought the officer would check another room and would certainly come back to his room later. Therefore, every night before sleeping, his squad would intentionally lie down sideways to peek outside. Each time, they would wait to see if anyone was on patrol. If someone was checking on the soldiers sleeping during the break, they would close their eyes and pretend to be sleeping. He too would lie there with his face towards the door to see if that person entered his room for a check, to prepare his mindset. At that time, he couldn't sleep, so he lay still and listened closely to the footsteps to know whether that person had come to his room yet. He said that the closer it got to midnight, the quieter the atmosphere became. He could only hear the sound of that person walking, and he could hear it very clearly, especially the silhouette that had appeared in the corridor. He saw that person walk following a zigzag movement, but backward. He lay there thinking, sensing that person stepping slowly towards his bed. When that person stood right at the head of his bed, he couldn't close his eyes. He described that shadow coming closer to his bed, since he was sleeping on the top bunk. The head of that person would be at eye level with his face as they turned towards each other. However, he described that face as blurry. he couldn't see it clearly. On the top of that person's head, he thought they might be wearing a straw hat, and it blurred out the majority of their features. When he saw that scene, he knew for sure he confronted something and thought, "Oh no, I encountered it." At that moment, he could only pray silently, but his mouth felt stuck. He couldn't say any prayers. He just prayed in his heart. At that moment, he was both praying and trying to turn his body as if he were stuck to the wall. Though he couldn't turn, his body felt stiff. He said that lying there, he prayed for about 12 minutes, and the shadow stood there, still grinning with its teeth exposed, and it had very long teeth extending from below the top of its mouth to its ears. He said, "Oh my God." At that moment, I was praying as quickly as possible, but that shadow still stood there with a huge grin. He felt like he wanted to cry so much, but he couldn't shed a tear. Suddenly, he remembered the Great Compassion mantra, so he tried to recite it, managing to complete most of the mantra, and saw that shadow begin to slowly dissolve. However, it seemed to vanish, starting from the lower half of its body, while the upper half was still present, still grinning at him. When he realized that, he kept reciting it once more until that shadow completely faded. He continued reciting several times until he fell asleep. The next morning, when he awoke late, he shared with his squad leader and his fellow soldiers in the room, and they all claimed to have seen the same shadow at night. They remarked that this shadow wasn't a soldier. In short, he felt quite odd because the sound of that shadow walking sounded as if it were on solid ground, but the others said it wasn't about that, although they could hear footsteps. The image they saw was that of a shadow moving glidingly, not like a person walking. Since that day onward, every night before sleeping, he would recite the Great Compassion mantra, and he wouldn't dare sleep early, lest he would encounter that shadow again. It wasn't until he had been in his unit for about a quarter that he was assigned night watch duty, as he was still a new soldier. He was told to only patrol the immediate area where they were stationed. In that night, he was assigned to guard from midnight to 1 a.m., and, usually, there would be 2 of them on guard together, but each person would stand at opposite ends of the area, simply walking to patrol the unit. He thought, "Oh my God, patrolling in the late hours while being in the cold forest is really chilly," so he kept going to the restroom frequently. The restroom was situated about 30 to 40 meters away from the guard post. He described how to get to the restroom, having to pass through the shower area, with the back containing toilet paper. He mentioned that these toilets were built in an L shape, generally at night. They were very deserted, and it was quite dark inside. Each restroom contained many bathrooms and toilets. He slowly walked toward the restroom to relieve himself. He thought, if he's going to the bathroom, he should have finished already, yet a few minutes later he called out again. At that point, he had finished and still wanted to go out to check if someone was in there, wondering if someone went inside to use their phone while pretending to go to the restroom. He thought someone could be in there pretending to use the restroom while actually trying to hide and use the phone, and just when he stepped out, he discovered the restroom was locked from the outside. He exclaimed, "Oh my God, I had goosebumps all over." At that moment, he felt his spine tingle with dread. He ran out as fast as possible and recounted this to his friend who was on guard with him. The 2 of them decided to patrol outside until their duty ended. The next morning, he casually chatted with some older soldiers about it, and one of them said the reason that restroom is locked is because a soldier a few years ago, after a heartbreak, locked himself in there and hung himself to death. So after that soldier died, he disturbed others. Whenever someone goes to the restroom at that particular stall, if they hear it call out and then the toilet floods, they would be all wet. If not drenched, the outside door gets locked. Therefore, many soldiers had experienced these incidents, leading them to lock the restroom for good. After hearing this, he felt very scared. He promised himself that from that point onward, if he needed to go, he would just go outside or in the bushes, and he would never dare step into that restroom again. However, that restroom still got unlocked on weekends for cleaning and then locked again for not being in use, forcing him to rush to that restroom again. Upon arriving there, he was instantly reminded of the haunting experience he had experienced the previous time, now made worse by the intense suffering in his stomach. He desperately needed to do his business, But he couldn't just go once to relieve himself, having already gone. He felt intense pain in his stomach and had to rush back into that restroom again. But this time he resolved to go to an older restroom, a different old one from his previous experience, because he couldn't dare sit in his previous haunted one. After using the restroom, he quickly washed his hands and walked out. Before stepping outside towards his unit, he had to pass by the shower area first. As he walked past, he heard the sound of water running inside. As he stood there, he found it strange because he thought that there were only new soldiers in the area, and no one would want to bathe at this hour, especially in the cold, mountainous nights. They must have been freezing, so he felt quite odd and just kept going. As he kept walking, he finally reached the restroom and observed a strange phenomenon. There was a soft glow inside, and upon glancing, he saw the silhouettes of two children surfacing and disappearing in the water of the shared basin, and those kids appeared to be playing in it. He felt too terrified to describe it, as his two children appeared to be naked or even translucent, glowing wildly without clothing, while their skin appeared very pale, like a jellyfish, and looked somewhat creepy. At that moment, he felt panic gripping him. After stepping outside and seeing these strange figures, he wore a face filled with fright. He fled outside as quickly as possible. Upon exiting, he could still hear the loud giggles of those two children behind him, taunting him as they laughed. Feeling anxious, he said, "Drop dead," and he fled rapidly. The very next day, whether it was due to being too frightened, he did not feel the urge to relieve himself anymore, feeling as if all his previous anxieties had evaporated into thin air. Had he gone in again, he surely would have fainted in place due to all the fright he encountered. Moving on to another incident. He was on guard duty in the late night hours. This night, he was on guard with another comrade, and they were pretty talkative, so they spent the time just chatting. It was around 11 p.m. or nearing midnight when the conversation continued. As they talked, they instinctively looked around at the whole area, observing with keen interest. That night, after both turned to face the front, he noticed there was still one window in the dining hall left open. As they were standing there chatting, he casually glanced at the window in the dining hall, and he noted that he saw it keep opening and closing as if swayed by a breeze. He thought, "What's going on in the dining hall? Can't help but look over to see if it's some officer or someone checking." But right after he spoke to his friend, his comrade warned him, "Forget it. Do not bother with it." However, he noticed his friend sounded apprehensive. Plus, his voice trembled in a strange way. He replied, saying, "Right, let's not think about it." But the moment barely passed, and they continued to share random conversations while instinctively keeping an eye on the window anytime it moved. The longer they kept watching, the clearer they could see that the window would sometimes open, then close again, almost as if there was a force at play there, opening and closing the window continuously. On the fourth glance, he distinctly saw a pale white shadow. Just observing that sight made his hair stand on end. He quickly walked to his partner's side. Both moved a little further away, having lost sight of the shadow, lessening there. Hello. Welcome back, everyone, to the YouTube channel of Ghost Stories by Uncle Ba Dewey. I hope everyone has an exciting time listening to ghost stories today. Thank you all very much. That's all for now. Let's start today's story. Today, Dewey will present a story related to ghostly navigation, also known as being led astray by Google Maps. By now, when we've been using the Google Maps app to navigate, at least once we have been led the wrong way, taking us to unfamiliar places that don't match what's displayed on the map. And this story is just like that. In general, this young lady shared her story with Dewey coincidentally after she happened to watch a clip of Dewey telling the first episode. Dewey told this story on TikTok. The story is about a young lady and her boyfriend traveling together in Vung Tau, going on a motorcycle trip, and they were misled by Google Maps into a very deserted area. If they hadn't escaped that night, they might have died from fright or maybe being robbed. So, after hearing that story, the girl suddenly remembered her own experience when she was misled on the road. After listening to that story, she felt it resonated with her situation and the case of her friend who got lost in Siuchi district. This girl mentioned that her grandmother's house is at the Gomez intersection, while she lives and works in Thursday Dalmote City, Binduong. Generally, she often visits her grandmother, and each time she goes, it's usually around 7 p.m. when she gets back home. But on that particular day, when she visited her grandmother, it happened to be Mother's Day, so she took her grandmother and others to the National Highway to eat. That day, she decided to use the 7-seat car from her company, a car borrowed from her boss. What's special about this car is that it didn't have any images of Buddha or anything else displayed. It was totally plain. When driving back home on a familiar route, she usually doesn't worry about anything, and it was around 10 p.m. when she intended to leave. However, that night, unexpectedly, the police were blocking the way on Huynh Van Bitch Street. Furthermore, the road she usually took was restricted to cars from 10 p.m. to 5 a.m. So people can imagine from Thursday Dalmote to Gomez intersection, there are 2 routes to take, and the shortest one is Huynh Van Bitch Street, which she was preparing to take. The other route requires a detour through Siu Chi to get back home. So upon seeing that the road was closed to cars, she decided to take the Siu Chi route home. However, the inconvenient part was that she wasn't familiar with that road, so she turned on Google Maps for navigation. At this moment, Google Maps instructed her to go straight toward Phu Quang Bridge, which is about 10 minutes away from her place. Looking at Google Maps, she drove along for a while, and it directed her straight into Huynh Van Tan Street. To enter Huynh Van Tan Street from the National Highway, you must navigate through the motorcycle lane, but on that thorny night around 10:40, there were many motorcycles, preventing her from entering the lane. Even when she managed to get into Huynh Van Tan Street, she was aware of the way home, but seeing the heavy motorcycle traffic, she glanced back at Google Maps again, which suggested another straight path to home. So she decided to take that route without turning. After a while, the app instructed her to turn into a big street whose name she forgot. As she drove on the big road, initially lined with houses, it soon transitioned into narrower paths, leading deeper into an area devoid of any habitation, surrounded solely by tall trees. At that point, she began to have doubts, but continued to trust Google Maps. Looking at the time, it was already past 11 p.m., and her fear intensified. Nevertheless, she pushed on since the map only indicated a straight route. As she continued navigating, she noticed vast expanses of rubber trees and the absence of any human dwellings. Deeply engaged in the route suggested by the map, it notified her that there were 15 minutes left until reaching Phu Quang Bridge. Even after following this disturbing guidance, she encountered roads that were no longer paved, just potholes and gravel. She could imagine that if she were to be approached by thieves in this desolate place, her body would never be found. Frustrated and frightened, she began reciting prayers for relief. Suddenly, amid her panic, Google Maps instructed her anew, "Keep going straight." Following its guidance, she found herself at a forbidding sign indicating it was prohibited to enter, effectively blocking her path. In that moment, she was nearly in tears, overwhelmed by fear. She had swiftly driven toward that point only to face an impasse with no way forward. Feeling lost, she initiated a video call with her boss, explaining her situation and sending her location while asking for help. After a brief exchange, her boss responded with a chilling message. He asked which road she had taken to get to that isolated location because, according to the map, her location was hovering without any indication of a neighborhood she should currently be in. Thus, the pin dropped was unclear. Her boss suggested she reverse course and follow her instincts to navigate back to the last known road. While he would contact a friend living in Siu Chi who knew the local roads to assist her. Following that, she turned her car around, shaking with fear but obediently reciting prayers. She was panic-stricken, praying silently for the spirits to not disturb her, pleading for freedom from this ordeal. As she drove, a voice seemed to suggest that she take a left turn, leading directly back to Huynh Van Tan Street. Within moments, she encountered the familiar sight of a supermarket and a few motorcycles, allowing her to realize she was truly safe. In that instant, she snapped a hurried photo to document her relief. This is a real experience she captured when she was petrified. It wasn't a staged image from the internet. Inside that street, there were no streetlights awake. Once she managed to exit that dim corridor, she later contacted her boss, who breathed a sigh of relief upon hearing she was all right. Meanwhile, he reached out to his friend, asking about the strange road she'd traveled on, discovering it was an abandoned dead end with no one living further down. Both the regular and strange occurrences she experienced further prompted concerns. The following story took place in Kinjio, relayed to us by an accountant from her company, about a man believed to be named Nan. One Saturday, employees of the company made an outing towards an underground tunnel in Kinjio, a site reminiscent of Siuchi tunnels, showcasing models honoring Vietnam's wartime history. After a while at the main site, they decided to paddle across to a small island for exploration. Only women ventured over while the men reclined with drinks on the other side. Eventually, the men, having drunk heavily, decided to row over, and while there, they encountered figurines representing soldiers from the Vietnam War. Nan roamed, later stopped at one statue depicting a soldier sawing a bomb. Casually, he remarked that no one was more idle than the Vietnamese soldiers back then, seated with bombs while others were on alert for invasions. He snapped numerous photos while jesting. Soon, he returned home, and as typical after trips, the accountant asked if he brought back any snacks. However, his dismissive response startled her. Oddly, he seemed irritable and out of character. Following that Sunday, nothing seemed amiss, but on the night of Tuesday, after drinking with colleagues into the twilight, he returned home around midnight. Upon entering his room, Nan was shocked to see a person lying on his bed, facing the wall. Still intoxicated, he assumed he was hallucinating, for the figure vanished in the light he flicked on. Investing little concern, he returned to bed, covering himself with a mosquito net, a habit he had. However, moments later, despite deep sleep, he felt an icy grip up his legs, sun through his body, indicating an unseen pressure he could not shake off. It felt akin to 100-ton rock crushing him. As dawn neared, his struggles ceased, and he laid there murmuring prayers. Presently, the weight lifted, his eyes peeled open to glimpse the clock flashing 2 a.m. With no heart left to sleep, he spent the night awake, gearing up for work. When morning arrived, he confided in an editor about his disconcerting night, finally requesting ridding the images he captured at Kinjio. Later, he detailed this unnerving episode to his family, receiving admonishments from his father for engaging in nonsensical behavior. Shockingly, the father insisted he consult an exorcist to discern if a female ghost had followed him. The exorcist declared that he was pursued by a male ghost, leaving him apprehensive. After suggestions to present offerings for permission to leave, he complied, apologizing for unwittingly offending anyone, with hopes that he would remain untroubled henceforth. The subsequent story shares the harrowing tale of a porridge seller haunted by spirits. This transpired long ago when his grandmother was around 9 or 10. At that time, her father served as an exorcist, adept at vanquishing spirits, residing in Din Quan, Dong Nai, an area notably poor back then. Her grandmother remembers living in the modest surroundings of a thatched house, notably abject. Nearby resided a woman, Ms. Oot, who sold porridge at midnight. At around 3 a.m., she would begin selling amid bustling market life as villagers prepare to head out for produce sales. On one particular night, Ms. 2 was preparing her pot of porridge when a woman around 19 or 20 years asked for porridge. Without hesitation, Ms. Oot promptly supplied a bowl, only to realize the fire beneath her cauldron had extinguished. As she fussed about rekindling the flames, the patron requested a second bowl, and that astonished her, as she thought it unusual for someone to devour so fast. Ms. Oot glanced again and noticed the woman holding the bowl while gripping her throat. The bizarre scenario rattled her severely, causing her to flee home and be bettered in the next day due to fever. In the meantime, desperate, her father, the Ghostbuster, discovered Ms. Oot's absence. He instructed Grandma to check on Mrs. Oot, worried she might be unwell. Upon arrival, they found Ms. Oot bedridden and feeding her porridge. Grandma inquired whether she had hallucinated. Yet Ms. Oot remained adamant about the eerie encounter. Days passed until nighttime when Ms. Oot, fearful after her frightening ordeal, witnessed a spirit emerge, dragging her by the feet, whirling her around the floor before hoisting her up to the ceiling. Terrified, she banged on her neighbor's door, requesting assistance, waking Grandma and her father, who promptly proceeded to quell the force tormenting her. At that moment, Grandma observed her father performing rituals involving swords and charms within Ms. Oot's abode, breaking dishware from the chaos. Subsequently, her father's return was marked by sealing a small jar meant for entrapment. Over the years, Grandma observed a variety of strange happenings originating from that family's house before ceasing altogether. As for today's concluding tale, it features a haunting porcelain doll from Cambodia. This narrative centers around a woman named Hugh, who, alongside a prosperous family, saw her course altered upon her father's 2 marriages prior to a 3rd spouse. Soon enough, both previous wives died, eventually remarrying a stable partner. After appropriate time transitions, her father crafted a will dividing his wealth among his offspring, urging each to self-establish their professions. Hugh thrived within considerable success in her textile factory. As unforeseen circumstances in material supply surfaced, Hugh needed to travel abroad to resolve issues. As she arrived at her overseas hotel, word reached her that her father had passed away in Vietnam. Shocked and hurried back, this woman soon faced yet another tragedy, with a brother dying tragically in an accident. Overwhelmed, she proceeded with both funerals, but was left with a stripped workforce seeking to leave due to the tragic atmosphere. For her, that was hardly comforting. She extended offers for help to any remaining staff, yet they declined, expressing disquieting fears over supernatural entities. Intrigued, Hugh pressed the maid to explain why she feared the household in which they resided. Curiosity had been piqued after many strange incidents stemmed from the time her father vacated the premises alongside his last wife. The maid described abhorrent visions of spirits waltzing around the property each night, despite the day being uneventful. The maid's insight readied Hugh for an exploration of her father's old office that commenced elementary chills. Upon entering the room, she stumbled upon an ornately crafted doll with porcelain features. On closer inspection, she noticed a tightly sealed note affixed to the rear of the doll. After inquiring about the strange object, the exorcist explained that it harbored remnants of her father's lost wives, replacing them with disturbing malevolent entities disguised as former affections. Furthermore, she unearthed that her father committed suicide after being plagued by revelations regarding the doll's deceit, leading to devastating repercussions for his family. Consequently, familial tragedies ensued. Both her siblings had experienced inexplicable fates unexplained within their family's tragic entanglements. Presently, Hugh has shifted her existence abroad, leaving behind her inherited property bearing witness to choked spirits seeking liberation. Currently, the house remains untouched and abandoned, echoing lingering traces of confusion across space and time. However, Hugh, in her current respects, remains oblivious to the permanence of these plights while struggling for understanding. Well, everyone, that's the conclusion of today's saga. What do you think about this story? Please leave a comment below to share your thoughts. We look forward to your reflections as we await the next tales of spookiness. Goodbye, everyone.